start by reading something from a recent publication that I'm making my way through. I'm using it for occasions like this. It's the Blue Notes, an anthology of love, justice, and liberation by the Black Lives UU community. And the piece that I'm going to read tonight to open a sacred space for us is by Everett Hoagland, entitled Invocation. Architect of icebergs, rainbows, jeweler of crystals, sand grains, snowflakes, atoms, mason whose tools are glaciers, rain, rivers, ocean, chemist who made blood of seawater, bone of minerals and stone, milk of love, whatever. You are, I know this, spinner. You are everywhere in all the ever-changing above, whirling around us. Yes, in the loose strands, in the rough weave of the common, cloth threaded with our DNA on the hubbed, spoked, spinning wheel that is this world, solar system, galaxy, universe. Help us to see ourselves in all creation and all creation in ourselves in one another. Remind those of us who like connections made with smiles, metaphors, symbols, that all of us are, everything is already connected. Remind us that as the oceans go, so go we. As the air goes, so go we. As other life forms on Earth go, so go we. As our planet goes, so go we. Mysterious muse who inspired in the beginning was the word. Edit our thoughts so our ethics, our politics, and our actions, the afterlives of our word. So thank you. With that, I open a sacred space for our discernment, learning, and contemplation on the matters of carbon pricing. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce our two guests tonight from the Citizen Climate Lobby. CCL is well known to many UUs. CCL is a favorite place for UU advocacy energy, and we honor and cherish the relationship that so many of us have with CCL. And we're particularly pleased tonight to have Brett with us, Brett Cease, who is a UU. We're particularly proud of that. And Brett has been volunteering with CCL since 2011. He serves as the Education and Engagement Director, where he strives to develop learning pathways that create the most empowered and informed citizen lobbyists possible. And in that regard, we are simpatico in our missions. At UUSJ, we want as many UUs as possible to be citizen lobbyists, citizen advocates. As a C3, we don't like that word, lobbyists, but in any case, Brett began his career in northern Minnesota as a wilderness program director and lead instructor for several outdoor education nonprofits, including Outward Bound, connecting civic engagement with democratic participation and issue-based advocacy. Brett has taught undergraduate policy courses, high school social studies, and campus sustainabilities with dual masters in education and legislative studies. And he has a PhD in public policy and political economy. He lives in Duluth, Minnesota, and always looks forward to the next local ultimate Frisbee game and time with his beautiful wife, and dusting off his cello, and fishing on the river, and home brewing craft beer. And I will say don't be thrown for a loop, but he's been growing his hair out during this pandemic. So his picture is a little bit different than on our publications. Kesten Bozinovic is first started with CCL as an intern in 2017, working with Amy Bennett to schedule CCL's congressional lobby events. She then transitioned to intern at San Diego headquarters for the organization's executive director. And she is now working with the government affairs team as the liaison coordinator and executive assistant. Kesten is currently pursuing a master's degree. So I'm going to ask that when we get to the Q&A portion of the evening, that people familiarize themselves with that little reactions button that has a happy face and a plus sign on it, and raise your hand, because I will do my best to monitor the chat, but I will be better at seeing who has raised their hand. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Brett. Thank you so much, Brett, for joining us.
Oh man, I am honored. Thank you, Pablo and Paulette and everyone for joining us tonight on this beautiful Wednesday evening. And I'm going to queue up my slides here, but while I do, I would like to just acknowledge my home congregation of UUCD here in Duluth, the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Duluth. And I'd also love to make sure just to acknowledge that I'm here standing on the shoulders of those that came before here in the northern Minnesota territory of the Anishinaabe people, who still reside and have a rich culture that I have been privileged to learn from and continue to be strengthened by. So thank you for starting with that acknowledgement as well, Pablo. So we are here tonight. I put a link in the slides in the chat where you can follow us with our slides tonight. Our goal in the next 30 minutes is going to really be making the case for why carbon fee with cashback is key to meeting President Biden's goals. What I'd like to do, we always start with a little housekeeping slide. I think Pablo's already done a wonderful job of that, walking people through how to use Zoom. It looks like all of us are old hands here on this. So the only thing I'll just share is that as we go through tonight, if you have questions, given that we're going to be packing a lot in, given that we have a 30-minute window to save a lot of time for Q&A, please click on that little chat icon and start typing your questions. Kesten and I are going to be trading off back and forth in presentations. So the other one of us is happy to start providing any links or any responses that we have. And please know that we'll get to the questions when we get the Q&A period based on some of those chats too. So we'd love to make sure to address any of your questions from the very beginning here rather than waiting 30 minutes in. And Pablo's already done a wonderful job, if that's all right with you, Kesten, in introducing ourselves. So I'll just skip right to the main learning goals that we have. And that is, if we've done our job well for our focus tonight, we really want to walk away with the following three areas that we're emphasizing: the power of pricing carbon with cashback, reviewing what's currently being considered, as well as really what's been passed already in the current Congress, and how all of this intersects in meeting our broad and ambitious climate goals. So I'll start with really a review of how we're meeting those goals, or really what those goals are, and how the power of cashback carbon pricing can lead to that. Kesten's then going to be reviewing a lot more about the legislative review of the last year, what the heck has happened on the Hill, what hasn't happened, and how we can actually break the logjam and get things through to make sure that significant climate legislation is passed. And then I'll review with focusing on those local actions that we can all take. So let's set the stage here, if that's the case then. And here is our current president, and a quote from him from last year, a year ago now, 2 days from now, on the Earth Day Summit he held as his first year in office, that set our country out on the ambitious road to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions reductions in half by the end of this decade. So in 10 years, 50% reductions based on 2005 levels. And so that is the benchmark that we're going to be looking at tonight, and where we can get to achieving that international commitment that we've made thanks to the President's Summit. So I know that a lot of you looking around tonight are friendly faces. Thank you all so much. A quick shout out just to all the wonderful CCL friends and congregational members across UUs here throughout the country tonight. It's so good to see your faces. It's so meaningful to have you join us. I know for a lot of this is probably a really simple review, but I think it's also an important one, especially if this is something that may be new to you or that you haven't heard for a while. And that is just the basis, again, of what CCL, Citizens Climate Lobby, has been focused on for the last decade plus and really advocating for. As an organization, our mission is to empower everyone to experience individual and political breakthroughs in exercising their personal and political power. So that's very much in alignment with USJ and your principles, as Pablo shared. And at the same time, what we're also focused on is trying to build political will and support in Congress to have passed very strong climate legislation in the form of something that we have called carbon fee and dividend. And essentially that policy stands on 3 legs. And so let me briefly review what each of those are. And then especially as we get to Q&A, if any of this is important to come back to, I know that I'm not going to give a deep dive into this topic right now. So number 1, that first leg of the stool is charging a steadily rising fee on fossil fuel emissions as soon as they enter our economy. And so that means coal, oil, and natural gas would be assessed a fee where they first enter with a pipeline or a wellhead, or if they're being imported at the port of entry. That is done basically for several reasons, one of which is it's administratively the simplest place. So it creates the least amount of additional bureaucracy. All of these different materials are already being weighed, and we know the amount of carbon they emit when they are burned due to that weight. So it would be the addition of a simple additional tax line in their payment process as they enter our economy. And the second thing that we want to make sure to do with such an approach is capture all emissions, right? We're not just targeting one sector like the power sector. We want to make sure that the very culprits that have been responsible for our warming world are levied across any industry or sector. So that's why this is an economy-wide price. The price starts low, $15 a ton, let's say, and then raises $10 annually. And that's where the key second step of this stool comes in. And that is the government then has a whole host of revenue to decide how they can spend it. And what we've always advocated for is to look out for especially the lower and middle income earners by returning 100% of that net revenue. So 100% meaning minus the net revenue of the administrative costs back to households in the form of a monthly carbon cashback. So you and I, each of us adults would get full shares, children would get half shares, and that would make sure that well over 2/3 of our households, especially lower or middle income earners, are shielded from energy rising increases, and that all of us can participate in putting solutions to work with that money. It's our money to spend as we see fit, and to be incentivized in saving that money long-term by investing in clean energy. And the third and equally critical element is adopting a carbon border adjustment. And by doing that, we want to make sure that we are leveling the playing field. We want to make sure that goods coming in from other countries that don't have a similar price have to pay us at our border, so that we're not creating a disadvantage for importing a whole glut of cheap and dirty energy produced goods. And we also want to make sure to rebate that money if we're going to basically sell goods on the international market. And essentially that would address an important concern to make sure that countries that are exporting goods that we're exporting to other countries with no carbon price address a really common concern, which is carbon leakage, basically creating a policy here that would incentivize dirty manufacturing elsewhere. And we also want to make sure to pull in other countries to bring in and ramp up the scale of their ambition. So as we impose this policy, other countries are going to be incentivized to actually adopting similarly equivalent policies in their own regard, rather than having to pay the US for that same trade right. So another key thing that I think is really important to acknowledge just right from the bat is that I think it's really important to name that carbon fee and dividend will not solve the entire problem that we face with managing the threats from our changing climate alone. And it's not going to address all of the important environmental justice concerns that we face. We do think that it's going to make it better for those that are currently suffering, and that's why we're so focused on it. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions is also going to reduce pollutants that we'll find out that negatively harm human health. And we also know that putting that money back in the pockets of over 90% of low-income American households helps economically for families through that transition. So while it's not a cure-all for solving climate change, we think that it's a step in that right direction. And one of the reasons why we're so confident of it is that a lot of modeling out there continues to highlight that if we're true to our net zero by mid-century goals of really decarbonizing our entire economy, that this policy is a strong part of that pathway to get there. So this chart has a lot of moving parts. I'm just going to briefly showcase 3 parts of this to help us understand it. We can return to it later. The gray line up top is presuming that no different policies are enacted, business as usual. How much will our emissions reduce based on where they're at currently by the year 2050? This is a timeline as we move linearly. So 5% reductions at most if nothing else changes. We know, and the IPCC just released its most recent 6th assessment, that to stay within that critically important 1.5 degree to 2 degrees Celsius window of not elevating our global temperature any more than that, we have to stay on an emissions pathway within this band. And that is what this green modeling line and these targets after that achieve, really bringing us down and making sure that we can stay on track to those important science-based targets. So a big shout out to all of those that have been involved with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recent support. We've been doing a lot of emphasis on that, and we actually have a training tomorrow night that I can put a link, really reviewing a lot of what it says, especially even about carbon pricing. So again, as a review, we love this policy because it keeps us on track for the best available science and economics to achieve those emission reduction goals of reaching net zero by 2050. It provides abundant clean energy. It makes sure that we're addressing the pollutants and the important way that we're already negatively impacting human health right now by not transitioning. We know that there are studies after studies that have highlighted that by putting a price on carbon, we're going to make sure that we can save tens of thousands of Americans' lives annually, basically premature deaths that are being caused by all of those critical air pollutants, and sickening thousands more. And we also know that this money, this policy puts money back in pockets. So it especially looks out for those that can least afford any transition without being looked after. And the thing that I'd also like to highlight real quick before passing this to Kesten is that this policy has the strong support of organizations, individuals, thought leaders, intergovernment panels, academies of science. We've got faith groups, local governments, nonprofits, businesses, prominent individuals, cities, states, you name it. If you're curious, a specific list about who has already signed on in support for more of these types of policies, putting a price on carbon, returning the money back to households, check out these 2 links in the chat. And thank you to Kesten for the link already to the IPCC training. And lastly, and most importantly, I take the credit here from Nadine on this one. Our 2 Unitarian Universalist members of Congress count themselves among this august body of supporters of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which is a policy that is in the House right now that abides by those same principles that I just reviewed. And so we've got 95 co-sponsors of this policy. And before jumping more into what this all means today and what CCL has been up to, what I'm naturally going to transition to is passing it to Kesten to review a little bit more about where we've been and what we can expect from our current Congress.
Okay, thank you, Brett. I just want to start off by acknowledging that I'm calling from Washington, D.C., which is the traditional lands of the Nacotchtank people. And with that, we're going to start off with some good news in terms of climate legislation last year by going through some of the climate provisions that were included and passed in the bipartisan infrastructure package. So after the House passage of a much larger infrastructure package and months of negotiations, in June of 2021, key senators on both sides of the aisle and the White House reached an agreement on a bipartisan framework for a comprehensive infrastructure reform bill. This resulting compromise of a bipartisan infrastructure package includes $550 billion in federal investments over 5 years, while the remaining of that $1 trillion renews existing transportation funding. So the legislation covers everything from bridges and roads to the nation's broadband, water, and energy systems. The Senate passed the infrastructure package known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act in August by a strong bipartisan vote of 69 to 30. The House vote to pass this was postponed. We'll get into the reasons why a little bit later. But ultimately, on November 5th of 2021, The House passed the bipartisan bill by a vote of 228 to 206. It was then sent to the president's desk for his signature, and he did sign it, and it's now passed. And so we're going to talk about some of the climate provisions that were included in that infrastructure package. Now, CCL and CCL volunteers worked with members of Congress for months to advocate for the inclusion of bipartisan climate infrastructure policies, which actually went beyond the scope of what is traditionally considered infrastructure. And the final package includes historic investments in resiliency, clean energy, and environmental remediation. So in terms of resiliency, the investments there will provide $47.2 billion for climate change mitigation and resilience, which includes funding for waste management, flood and wildfire mitigation, drought, coastal resiliency, ecosystem restoration, heat stress, and weatherization. And a portion of the funding is allocated to the Army Corps of Engineers, FEMA's Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration programs to make coastal communities more resilient in light of increasingly powerful storms. It also includes a historic $5 billion for the replacement of existing school buses with zero emission and clean school buses, with a priority on low-income, rural, and tribal schools. It also provides $2.5 billion for the replacement of existing ferries with low-carbon ferries and to assist states with essential rural ferry operation costs. Another $7.5 billion of funds would go towards alternative. Let me just see. Sorry. Another $7.5 billion would go towards alternative fuel corridors and to build out a national network of electric vehicle charging infrastructure in order to facilitate long distance. There we go.
I think, Christina, your line is muted or unmuted, actually. If you wanted to mute again, Christina, we can hear you.
Thank you, Brett.
I can hear.
I'm going to ask folks to please remember to mute themselves and mind your background noise. Thank you.
And so that funding would go to facilitate long distance EV travel, provide convenient charging where people actually live, work, and shop, so where they would be most likely to use them. And that federal funding will have a particular focus on rural, disadvantaged, and hard to reach communities. The bill also invests $65 billion to rebuild the electric grid. This is actually the largest investment in clean energy transmission and the electric grid in American history. And this funding upgrades our power infrastructure by including thousands of miles of new resilient transmission lines, which facilitate the expansion of renewable energy. It also creates a new grid deployment authority, which invests in research and development for advanced transmission and electricity distribution technologies. It promotes smart grid technologies that deliver flexibility and resiliency. And it also invests in demonstration projects and research hubs for next generation technologies like advanced nuclear reactors, carbon capture, and clean hydrogen. It also provides $21 billion in funds for environmental remediation and addressing legacy pollution by cleaning up brownfield and Superfund sites, reclaiming abandoned mine lands, and plugging orphan oil and gas wells. And so with that, that's just a quick summary of the bipartisan infrastructure package, well, specifically climate provisions in that package. This package will strengthen our nation's resilience to extreme weather and climate change while reducing greenhouse gas emissions, expanding access to clean drinking water, building up a clean power grid, and more. And again, it accomplishes one of Biden's main domestic priorities by providing $550 billion in new spending for infrastructure needs, including addressing climate change and resiliency. And not only was this great climate legislation that was passed, but it also delivered some big wins for CCL specifically. And while at CCL, we have our main policy solution, which Brett addressed, we also have bills that we advocate for known as supporting asks. So these are supporting asks that we can make to our members of Congress to move forward climate legislation. And provisions from two of those supporting asks that we threw a weight behind in 2021 were included in the infrastructure package. So provisions from the Hope for Homes Act, which creates rebates for homeowners to invest in energy efficiency improvements, and the SCALE Act, which supports financing and construction of CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. Now, I do want to highlight that while this bill includes climate provisions that we absolutely should celebrate, they're not at the scale needed to address climate change without further legislation. And so that's going to lead me into our next topic, which is budget reconciliation. And some of you might have heard this term used a lot in the past year. We're going to go through some of the background details involved in this budget reconciliation process. So first, to start off with, what is budget reconciliation? And budget reconciliation is a process that allows budget-specific related legislation to pass the filibuster, so it can pass with just 51 votes in the Senate, as opposed to the 2/3 majority that's usually needed to pass bills by regular order. Congress generally has one chance to include reconciliation per fiscal year, which is from October 1st to September 30th. In March of 2021, Congress used reconciliation to pass the American Rescue Plan as part of the 2021 fiscal year, which ended in September. And so now when we're talking about the budget reconciliation process, we're referring to the reconciliation process used again to pass a budget resolution for the 2022 fiscal year. So reconciliation allows Congress to enact legislation on taxes, spending, and the debt limit with only a majority vote in both the House and Senate. The reconciliation process begins in the House and the Senate when they both pass a budget resolution, which includes reconciliation instructions that will direct one or more committees to recommend changes to existing laws in order to achieve specified changes in their spending, revenues, deficits, and/or the debt limit. And there's this thing called the Byrd Rule, which regulates what can be included in the reconciliation process. And the Byrd Rule prohibits extraneous items from being in a bill passed through the reconciliation process. Now, unfortunately, that's as specific as it gets. The Senate parliamentarian gets the final say on what's considered extraneous. And so this is when we really rely on past reconciliation bills and policy experts to kind of predict what we think can be included in past through budget reconciliation. So once this resolution is passed, it's the overall target for spending and revenue, and it provides instructions to committees to achieve those overall targets. Now, these instructions and targets are not binding, and committees can propose legislation that differs from the original resolution as long as they can get this final approval in the final reconciliation vote. So earlier in 2021, both the House and the Senate passed their budget resolutions, which kicked off the reconciliation process. Since then, the House and Senate committees have gone through the process of crafting and debating and negotiating their portion of the final reconciliation bill. In October 2021, the Biden administration released their Build Back Better framework, which was essentially a starting point for what the administration hoped to see achieved in the reconciliation bill, including the provisions they wanted to see on climate. And with this administration's framework as a guidepost, the House and Senate have continued to write their version of the reconciliation bill. It's likely that it'll largely include what's in Biden's framework, but it won't be identical, and we're still in this negotiation phase. And the House passed their version of the reconciliation bill in November of 2021. It was then sent to the Senate. As of now, the bill does not yet have enough votes to pass the Senate, but there's indication that key members are still open to negotiations. And after the Senate passes their version of the reconciliation bill, we would expect one final vote on the amended bill by the House. And this would be the final bill that would be approved by both chambers, which would then be sent to the president's desk for a signature to be passed. So this is all to say that this has been a very complicated and drawn out process. There's still a lot of moving pieces and a lot of negotiations that are in play.
Kesten, are you okay actually for the sake of flow if we jump into the carbon pricing section and then we can come back to a few of those other slides for Q&A?
Of course.
If that's all right. So that was a perfect overview. I want to make sure to stay true to Pablo's presentation, since I was a little bit over focused on the fee and dividend part. Let's just jump in real quick after Kesten's review of where things stand to ultimately where we find ourselves in terms of CCL's efforts in budget reconciliation and basically what we are focused on right now, given the state of play that Kesten reviewed. So over the last year, again, thank you to all those that are on the line. CCL overall mobilized well over 168,000 calls and emails to Congress, reached over 4.5 million people in targeted phone banking and text banking and digital advertising campaigns. We published over 4,000 op-eds and letters to the editor and gained news coverage to advance climate legislation and keep our eye on the ball in all of these major news media outlets. And because of the results of all of you and many other climate advocates, we had those 5 pieces of bipartisan climate legislation signed into law that Kesten's reviewed, and 2 additional ones have passed through at least one of the 2 chambers in Congress. However, like Kesten's reminded us, obviously, if we are keeping our eye on the ball and we need to meet the emission reduction goals of 50% reductions by 2030, what else can we do? Well, we know that in the last year, the Senate Finance Committee has continued to emphasize that a carbon price is being considered in their proposals. The Senate Finance Committee is the committee of jurisdiction in the Senate considering how an actual carbon price may be implemented in terms of the budget reconciliation framework. We know also that at a sideline event in Glasgow at the Conference of the Parties, the big UN Summit on Climate this last fall, Senator Whitehouse told the press that they had secured the votes of 49 out of 50 senators. They had received the assurance of the House as well as the White House that basically should a carbon price be introduced and passed, both the House and the Senate, the White House would also pass it as well. And so what I'd like to do is just close with these 2 slides and then share briefly what all of us can also do to continue to amplify before we get to questions. And that is one final chart. I promise we won't do any more after this. But this, again, black top line shows business as usual scenarios. This is a chart overall that has been modeled by Resources for the Future, another wonderful energy and climate and environmental economics modeling firm. I put a link to it in the chat. And if you're curious, basically what they were trying to do was show all of the different policy scenarios that were being considered last fall and their collective or individual impact on our federal emission reductions pathways. So black would be business as usual. That's what the BAU stands for. And then basically the 2 that we're most curious on are essentially looking at this blue line, which would be an extension of those tax credits that Kesten was talking about, in addition to the Clean Electricity Payment Program, which we know currently is not in the negotiation for. But you can see right there, that blue line doesn't get us to that 50% reduction goal alone. What does get us there is by adding the additional central price path. That gets us on track to meeting the president's 50% reductions pledge, and it does so with or without whether or not you actually exempt gasoline from that pricing. We'll get into that in the details too. But I wanted to highlight this because it's absolutely critical to show the difference between doing nothing, doing some parts of the Build Back Better Act, and including that carbon fee as a part of the overall program. That's really the central thesis of what we're talking about tonight. We know and we love emphasizing in CCL that putting a price on carbon with cash back to households is a solutions multiplier, right? We know it's going to help not only achieve more emission reductions, it's going to allow us to have that border adjustment that we talked about earlier. It's going to allow us to have that carbon price be made permanent and extend beyond the 10-year window the budget reconciliation is limited to. And it's one of the few sticks that the Senate can actually rely on by passing such legislation with a simple majority. So it's actually a strong provision. It's not just spending, it's penalties, it's making sure through an actual price across economy-wide that we're actually making sure to wring out those emissions. So last and leastly, where do you all come in? Well, we know one of the key things that we've highlighted here, especially of late, we've seen a surge of thousands of new volunteers in the last several weeks due to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that just came out that really highlighted how urgent it is of a problem that we face, as well as one of the most effective tools that we have to making sure to address it by putting a price on carbon at Fee and Dividend support. We also know this, we have received a wealth of growth in the last several years. This chart shows overall the rapid spread of CCL chapters throughout the country. If you're tuning internationally in, know that we've got chapters for you as well in many other dozens of countries. And so if you're interested and you've not found out about CCL after tonight, Kesten's putting a link where you can join in the chat. Check us out. We're organized locally by chapters. Many of our group leaders on the call tonight would love to tell you a little bit more too when we get to Q&A. And we'd also love to just highlight right now, we are part of a larger movement, I'd say, in the climate ecosystem that is connecting the dots between what's happening with Ukraine and keeping our eye on the ball, not losing focus on making sure that how we can stand in support right now of the importance of not propping up the petrostate of Russia and giving that oil money to Putin to fight his war in Ukraine is by making sure that we are transitioning our country as well as in creating those incentives and others for clean energy. So if you're interested in finding out more about our Stand With Ukraine campaign, which has repurposed and re-envisioned a lot of those classic World War II posters calling people to action, check those out. Kesten's put a link in the chat. And we also have a wonderful social media presence. So with that, we would love to open it up for Q&A. We know that we've saved at least 15 minutes here. And I know that there's a lot of great discussion to be had, and I am happy to have it. So should we look at the chat ourselves, Pablo, or would you prefer to moderate?
I'm going to kick the ball off, and then we can, and then I'll try to moderate the chat as you answer questions. So I'll share when we announced this program. Well, first off, I want to thank Nadine for leading the CCL UU action team and connecting UUSJ to Brett and Kesten. Without her willingness to answer my many questions by email, this event wouldn't be brought to you this evening. And I know that many of you cherish her role in leadership on the issues. I will share that, again, please go to your dialog box or dialog strip, go to that reactions icon, press it, and then click the button that says raise your hand. I'd much prefer to recognize you and let you ask your question. But if you really want to rely on the chat, I will do my best, and so will, I guess, Brett. But one of the big questions that I heard prior to this event, a lot of you folks in, I'll say, in the woodworks, started sending me emails and saying, well, some version of, I believe that the carbon pricing strategy could have gotten us out of this mess if we'd been doing it for the past several decades. And then, so I want to put the question squarely to Brett and Kesten. How confident are you in the modeling that shows the importance of the carbon pricing strategy among the basket of strategies? Can you share with us how confident deploying the carbon pricing strategy at this juncture in the climate crisis will make a difference? It will make a difference.
Kesten, would you like to go first? Would you like me to?
Yeah, I can say my thoughts, and then Brett, if you have anything to add. So I'll say that we are pretty confident. There are multiple models that show that carbon pricing would achieve these emissions reductions that we need. And I'll also add that one of the benefits of carbon pricing is that you can pair it with other policies. You can pair it with regulations, you can pair it with subsidies, you can pair it with other policies that we need. Carbon pricing is not a silver bullet. It won't achieve the reductions that we need, but it's definitely a great first step. And another reason is you can implement it really fast. And so the speed of implementation is a lot faster than some of these other policies that we definitely need to rely on. And I don't, Brett, is there any specific modeling to pull up? I know we've got See if I can find a page on.
I think the best thing just to return to keep it simple. I mean, I know obviously, I don't know how much we've shared earlier tonight, but 3,500 economists throughout the country standing behind similar policies is a huge, huge milestone. So if people are concerned about kind of the consensus or what actual kind of people that study our economy think about this approach, I definitely would point to that economist statement, but resources for the future would be absolutely the most relevant and clear and salient link that I already put in the chat, because it addresses our political moment right now. It isn't saying conceptually, what emission reductions would have been starting 30 years ago. It's saying even today in 2020, 2021, 2022, what we can still expect should we apply the ramp up of that price that we've talked about. So I would definitely stand behind resources for the future. It's a wonderful economic modeling firm, well respected on both sides of the aisle, and we'll put a link to that in the chat. And specifically, I love the Martin Luther King Jr. quote. When in moments like this, when really struck with what to do, and the simple aphorism of the time is always right to do what is right. And I do feel like this is one of those critical elements that if we're serious about taking the challenge of climate change seriously, we need to make sure that of all possible policy outcomes, that a strong price on carbon is included in that so that we can meet those goals we've talked about. And I think you might be muted again, Pablo.
Thank you. So I guess I want to just dovetail on this since it came up in relation to this question. Where do you see the carbon pricing strategy in relationship to, I guess, one of the big alternatives, the sustainability transition policy? How do you answer questions about which approach is a more appropriate alternative at this juncture?
Yeah, I can take a first stab at it, and then Brett, if there's anything to add. So one of the benefits of a carbon pricing solution is that it's market-based in the sense that it helps shift the entire economy towards renewables. Brett addressed some of those points when we went through carbon pricing and specifically how it helps make renewables more affordable. And then I'll also add that, as I said before, it can definitely be implemented along with these other climate solutions. So I don't like to think of it as carbon pricing versus these other solutions. I like to think of it as carbon pricing in addition to all these other climate solutions that we absolutely need to implement. And I don't know, Brett, if there's anything you'd like to add there.
Well, I think one of the other things to highlight, and again, this is kind of just drawing on that second leg of the stool, is that we're talking, major billions of dollars of revenue as an outlay with a carbon price. And so ultimately, as the Senate or the House negotiates what they would ultimately like to see passed, there is certainly room for discussion on, should some of the money go to just transition spending or figuring out how to create additional protection for green jobs and making sure that workers that are displaced or any other priority that UUSG and others SJ mentioned are included in that. The elegance of making it straightforward and simple across the board cannot be understated enough, and that's ultimately why CCL has highlighted the importance of that direct dividend return or the carbon cashback. But there's definitely a lot of discussion. And in Congress right now, there are several other carbon pricing bills that have looked at using some of that revenue outlay for environmental justice priorities or for coal communities or for R&D spending or infrastructure rollout, climate resilience. So there's certainly a lot of ground to cover with that revenue. And we want to make sure as we continue to engage in that process that we hold to as much of that going back, especially to lower income earning households as possible. I don't know if that speaks to your question, Pablo.
And
I think, oh, go ahead.
I'll just add really quick, Brett mentioned we've got some carbon pricing bills that are in play. One of them, Save Our Futures Act, introduced by Senator Whitehouse, earmarks some of that, the money that's raised from a carbon price towards that EJ efforts and sustainable transition.
And So I just want to sort of follow up with a question from Randy Freed in the chat, since it was the first question that I saw. And it dovetails on
Do you want me to ask it myself,
Sure.
Pablo?
Go ahead, Randy, please do.
Okay, you indicated that you'd prefer not to read chat, so I'll just pose it myself. First, thanks very much, Brett and Kesten. That was a terrific presentation. I wanted to ask, one of the criticisms that's sometimes been leveled against carbon pricing approaches is that they're not, well, in fact, against all market-based approaches, is that they're not as effective as just flat regulation, a command and control across the board. They're not as effective at reducing environmental justice problems. And I wonder if you would reflect a little bit about what features of the carbon fee and cashback approach help to avoid environmental justice problems, or even help to solve existing environmental justice problems. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing, and I love to come back to this point, is you can absolutely pair carbon pricing with regulations. And so with carbon pricing, the big question is, what do you do with the dividend, right? And so CCL's preferred policy solution is you have a net revenue dividend where you return all the money to households as in equal shares as a dividend. And we have a policy that's in play, the Energy Innovation Act, that very closely follows what our proposed or our preferred solution is. And there was a households impact study done on that looked at how do households come out when you give the dividend back as it relates to these increased consumer prices that happen when you levy a carbon tax. And what this study found is that the bottom 3 quintiles, so the households in the bottom 3 quintiles of earning, actually come out ahead in terms of the money that they get back from the dividend when combating these rising prices, partially because these households typically use less energy than households in the top quintiles. So that's one thing that I can speak directly. Let me see, Brett, if there's anything I'm forgetting.
I think it's an essential question, and Randy, in the chat, or for anyone's benefit, I put a link where we have, CCL's environmental justice statement linked. I think the key thing to acknowledge is that we, as an organization, as any climate group, as an organization needs to do, is to show up and listen, and to not speak on behalf of these communities that are impacted or that are on the front line, that are, dealing with Cancer Alley or the pollution impacts of heavy industry that are clearly damaging lungs and causing premature deaths. So I think it's important for me to acknowledge that I can't speak on behalf of those communities, and that it's important for me as an advocate to show up and listen and to advocate in strength and in parallel to causes that matter to them. And I think it's also key to recognize, at the end of the day, environmental justice seeks to end the unfair concentration of unhealthy air and water pollution in these frontline communities, and to actually implement effective policies that mitigate that great harm that's caused by climate disruption and by the production of fossil fuels to these disadvantaged communities, these communities that have clearly been bearing the brunt. And so by far and away, the biggest thing that I would point to really highlight how fee and dividend style policies can specifically address that. And there's additional nuance that if people are particularly interested in, the Save Our Future Act, we can put a link to in the chat, charges additional fees actually on all of the different criteria pollutants in addition to what we've talked about tonight. So it takes it even to the next level for those that are particularly interested in the intersection between EJ and CF&D. But at the end of the day, the key thing that I would continue to highlight is that from an environmental justice perspective, if air quality is consistently killing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans, or causing premature deaths per year, by accelerating our transition away from burning these fossil fuels in the industry that we produce, in the electricity that we generate, in the transportation that we use, then absolutely it's a way that we can at least partly respond to that air pollution unjustly causing premature deaths in those communities. Will it absolutely solve the full problem? No. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. But will it help us accelerate that transition away from each of those sectors? My belief that it is, and that's why it's so important for me to continue to advocate for this strong price signal to finally get us off of using fossil fuels for all those purposes.
Brett, I see
Great,
an
thanks very
important-
much.
Thank you, Brett. I see an important thread in the chat that I'm going to lift up, and then I'll recognize Peter. But yes, the UUA endorsed this as a strategy, but I think it's fair to say that the UUA hasn't thrown its shoulder behind the strategy, in part because of a question that Lavona Grow has put into the chat, which is, usually you use follow the lead of frontline communities and Indigenous people, and Climate Justice Alliance and Indigenous Environmental Network do not support carbon pricing fee mechanisms because it doesn't keep the oil in, or the fossil fuels in the ground. And I think this is probably the principal reason we haven't seen the UUA lean into it. So, and it's a concern that I hear, and Lavona has heard, and others who have collaborated with UUSJ have heard routinely among faith-based actors. So can you address those concerns directly? And then a related issue is, someone observes to me, most corporations will consider taxes and fines as just fees and part of the cost of doing business. So related to that, why won't they just keep on doing that and continue to extract the fossil fuels that are creating this dastardly situation for us? Can you give us an answer on that question?
Yeah, absolutely. I can go first, Kesten, if you'd like, and pass it back to you. I think, Lavona, that's a great question. And I think a quick, acknowledgement first and foremost to the amazing and important work that groups like the Indigenous Environmental Network and CGA are doing. I've worked with in the past with Simone Senegals and have a huge respect for Tom Goldtooth, and actually volunteered even with IEN, back in the late thousands, even before getting involved with CCL. And so I do not see these two schools of thought, or different parts of the climate movement, as kind of polar opposites, or as absolutely one or the other in binary thinking. I think they're both doing essential work. I actually was involved as well, and stood shoulder to shoulder with a lot of the Line 3 protesters and spent a night in jail this last summer for the encroachment of the pipeline that was obviously a part of our Minnesota community. And so basically, I do think that these two are hand in hand. And I think one of the key strategy questions that we have to ask is, how can we get to the votes to make either of them happen? If people are in the mind to prioritize, keep it in the ground as the key priority, what can we do to reach that as an actual majority towards passage? At the same time, if we are focused on price on carbon, to make sure that we can actually ensure that through that strong price signal, that we eventually create so much incentive economically for us to transition to clean energy, because across sector, it's the cost preferred alternative to any other form of energy. I see those two as happening in parallel, and the strategies that are emergent that both need to be tested out so that we can address ultimately the crisis that we find ourselves in. And so in my mind, ultimately, by putting a strong price on carbon and making sure that if we can get that enacted in Congress, we're running this experiment to incentivize obviously cleaner and cleaner energy sources to be cost competitive and incentivized to be adopted at a much more widespread level than they are currently. It's not that we aren't already seeing those price curves go down. We are, and I think that's a huge thing to celebrate. All of us, even 10 years ago, compared to where we were now, could not have even imagined probably the price of solar at the PV level on our household being attained to where it's at. But if we want to even accelerate it further, here's one step that we can do. And if we can get that passed, it's absolutely critical. And if we can get the other parts of our coalition passed as well, that's critical too. So that would be kind of my ultimate kind of framework that I'd operate under from that first question.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that I absolutely agree with everything Brett said, and I just want to add a little bit to the difficulty of working in the political context. CCL strives to be, we're a bipartisan organization, but we've engaged in this very partisan reconciliation process because that's the best shot that we've seen at passing our preferred policy. And along with that, to be able to be included in budget reconciliation, it has to affect some part of the budget. And so it's unlikely that that the policy would be orchestrated in the way that we would like, with the full revenue returned. And so some of that revenue would be used for other initiatives to be able to affect the budget. And so that's just a comment on how it's difficult to work within this political context where you can't always get exactly what we would like, especially in terms of addressing a lot of EJ concerns.
Thank you, Kesten and Brett. Final question, and we want to honor the hour that we asked folks to join us for. And if you have to roll off, please do. But final question to Peter, who has his electronic hand raised and has been patiently waiting.
Thank you, Brett, and Kesten. I just wanted to actually make a quick comment. I'm sorry, I may have missed this, but I had an email interchange with Rick Knight of CCL regarding the impact of the Build Back Better environmental measures as they stood in November, and then adding the implementing the carbon fee and cashback or dividend as specified in the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And the response was that that would actually get us to President Biden's goal of 50% reduction by 2030, whereas the Build Back Better alone wouldn't, nor would the carbon fee. So just to emphasize the point that we need more than one solution, but we need our most powerful tools. And that's why my own congregation, Neighborhood Church in Pasadena, has endorsed the EICDA. So mostly just a comment, and thank you for what you're doing. And I'm out there trying to help out every day.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you so much. So with that, we've sort of reached the top of the hour, and I want to thank folks for joining us and staying with us. I'm just going to quickly read something that impressed me deeply when I was just beginning my career. It is out of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, a series of texts on how you develop industrial ecosystems and approaches and cases and tools. I had the privilege of working with Marian Chertow when I was in Puerto Rico, and she really impressed upon me the importance of long-term strategies needing to emulate some of the ways in which our natural ecosystem uses inputs and outputs. So ultimately, industrial symbiosis and industrial ecology broadly are aspects of sustainable development. The elusive quest to harmonize environment and economy. Some say that sustainable development is merely a storyline that generated world attention precisely because of its ambiguity. The optimistic side of this formulation is that locally, each of us can tell our own stories of sustainability by participating in industrial symbiosis. Self-organizing networks can happen where economically feasible with a bit of vision and surrender. So I leave you with that thought about how we fit together all the different moving parts. It's not exactly on our topic, but I think if we're talking about markets and the economics of how we address this problem, at least to my mind, it's relevant.
Pablo, I forgot I had one last slide from our favorite poem, Earthrise by Amanda Gorman. May I read this last stanza?
Of course.
All right, so I'll just send everyone off too with one of my favorite poems. As we all know, the inaugural poet Amanda Gorman inspired us all just 2 years ago. And this is a call for all of us to continue to engage in this crucial action and good trouble that we are engaged in. Just as we chose to go to the moon, we know it's never too soon to choose hope. We choose to do more than cope with climate change. We choose to end it